Good evening. Oh, wow.
Don't give it away. That was a surprise.
I'm sorry. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's installment in our lecture and film series, Black Atlantic Cinema. It's the last installment of this year. Oh, okay. Yeah. Whoa. It's the last installment of this year. We will have two more lectures in the winter term in January and February, and then we'll actually have 8 further engagements in from April to July. So it will be a very dense and intense summer season, and we hope that you will continue to follow what our guests have to say on cinema under the rubric of Black Atlantic Cinema. Tonight we're going to hear about Ousmane Sembene, who is broadly known as the father of African cinema. So you could ask yourself, what does he have to do with Black Atlantic cinema? And again, I'm not going to give the whole thing away, but Daniel Fairfax, our speaker tonight, is going to explain it to you. And he's not just going to talk about film, even though film and film theory and film history are his core activity. It has been my pleasure and privilege to work with Danny for going on certainly 15 years. We started working together when Danny volunteered to translate significant seminal texts from French film theory into English that had not been previously made accessible for a book series that we started almost 20 years ago called Film Theory Media History. And then in 2017, Danny had just concluded his dissertation at Yale and was looking for a job, and luckily we had one to offer, and Danny decided to join us here in Frankfurt. The book's been out, the book based on the dissertation has been out for, I think, 4 years, 3 years? 3 years. It's in open access, and it's a 2-volume study of French film theory and film criticism after 1968, with a focus on the Cahiers du Cinéma. It is a book that all of you, I think, you should read. This is a good season to do it. You have 2 weeks off. It's only 800 pages, and there is only useful and important information in that book. It's an incredible intellectual history of film theory and film criticism, and an incredible history of one of the most fruitful and decisive moments in the development of our field. So among many other things, Danny is one of the leading, if not the leading, historian of cinema studies. If we consider the fact that Paris really was the place where cinema studies as an intellectual enterprise took shape in the 1970s, if you don't count the fact that something similar was happening in Frankfurt at the same time. But that's a different story, and that's a story that remains to be written. That maybe that's a book we're going to be writing together at some point. But that's by far not the limit of Danny's interest. He's one of the most knowledgeable people in terms of global history that I've ever met. I don't think I've ever asked him if he's seen a film when the answer came back no. And I realized in some cases that I had some real catching up to do to get where Danny was on his knowledge of global film history, and that of course also includes African cinema, of which Daniel Fairfax's knowledge is comprehensive, as we will see right now. Among other things, Danny is also the co-curator of the series, and has been the co-curator and in some editions the main curator of lecture and film for the last 5 years. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the podium, and I'm really interested to hear which passages from this big book you're going to be quoting in your talk about Ousmane Sembene. Please.
to have lost the PowerPoint. Computer somehow got knocked out at some point. Computer's working. So maybe that's going to work now. There, yep, okay.
I think it's important not to move it.
I won't touch the computer at all. Thank you, Vincent, for that effusive introduction. I'm very touched to hear about myself. I want to start, though, with just saying a few things. Well, one little thing where I'll be speaking just in my own personal capacity and not as a representative of anything or anyone. But at the basis of this, let's say, the social political situation that we're looking at. Okay. At the basis of this film series is essentially the genocidal logic of Western imperialism that over the course of centuries dispossessed, displaced, and physically eliminated populations of millions of people. And we're seeing this same logic continue in the present day in Israel's annihilation of the Gaza Strip. And I think we also need to acknowledge that this is a genocide that is being perpetrated with the absolute complicity of the German state. Once again, genocide has become German Staatsräson. And for those of us who had thought or hoped that Germany might have learned a few lessons from its history, apparently it hasn't, or it's learnt the wrong ones. So my solidarity goes out to the victims of the genocide of Gaza right now. That's just what I wanted to say off the bat, because it's also kind of the elephant in the room. But right now I'll be talking about the film Mandabi by Ousmane Sembene from 1968. Why does it belong in this series? I'd have to look at an atlas again, but I'm pretty sure Senegal is actually on the Atlantic Ocean. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so that was my main. But we'll see. It's part, like what Mandabi really does is show post-independence Senegal's position within, let's say, a global economic system that extends, across the Atlantic, across, like all over the world, essentially. And I think Mandabi does this in very interesting ways. So that was kind of part of my motivation from including this film in the series. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, and I always kind of I always like wake up in the morning or like thinking, I got nothing. I don't know what I'm going to say about this film. And then end up preparing way too much, which might also be the case here. So we'll see how I go. But there is a few components to this presentation. I'll tell you a little bit about Ousmane Sembene, who he was. I'll give you a bit of an overview of the film in terms of its narrative, and then we're going to do a deep dive into the, let's say, the economics that Mandabi, I think, very skillfully illustrates. So those are going to be the kind of three, let's say, components of the lecture. Hopefully we get through all of them before you collapse in exhaustion, and we have enough energy for the wonderful film that we have later tonight. So who was Ousmane Sembene? Vincent, I think, mentioned he's often referred to as the father of African cinema. That's a kind of term I don't hugely love, because it has, first of all, there's kind of like the like connotations of paternalism, and somehow like, oh, he was this kind of founding figure, and everyone is his like descendants or children or underlings or whatever. So I would probably refrain from using Vincent, you distance yourself a little bit from that terminology as well. Nonetheless, he was very much a pioneering figure, both in African cinema, but also in African literature, which we'll get into. One very important aspect of Ousmane Sembene's, let's say, background is he was really an autodidact. So he was born not in Dakar, the then capital of colonial Senegal, but in a kind of town, I don't even know how to pronounce it, Ziguinchor, I guess. From relatively humble background. So his father was a fisherman. He himself left school at the age of 14, whereupon he moved to Dakar to then work in basically proletarian occupations, initially as a mechanic, then as a bricklayer. He's not going to university. He's not part of this kind of intellectual world, such as it existed in Dhaka at this time. He's really, I mean, he's working to survive. He has no educational credentials. At the same time, though, he's extremely voracious intellectually. He's reading a lot. He's trying to consume as much culture as he can, and he's doing it just kind of from his own steam, essentially. He has no institutional framework within which he's doing this. In 1944, at the age of 21, he joins the French army as a so-called tirailleur sénégalais. This was a kind of, I guess, a division of the French army using Senegalese soldiers, which had existed since the 19th century, but then was used at this point, obviously, in the Second World War. So his experience kind of fighting against fascism in France. He then returns to Dakar, where he joins the railway workforce and actually becomes very active in trade union struggles and in the strikes of the Senegalese railways, the kind of French-administered railways in Senegal at the time. He then moves back to Paris in 1948, where he lives in moves back to France in 1948, where he lives in Paris and Marseille. Works in the Citroën car factories in Paris and then in the docklands in Marseille. Marseille was the big port of France, obviously often also the port of entry for migrants from Africa to France, and he spent many years there. Here he kind of became quite a leading figure in the union movement, in the kind of unionization of the Marseille dock workers, and also joins the French Communist Party. So he's a card-carrying Communist Party member for many years, and had it, at this time also, on the basis of this kind of, his active participation and even leadership of working class struggles, becomes very much interested in and invested in Marxism and Marxist theory. While still in France, he publishes his first novel in 1956, Le Docker Noir, kind of based on his own experiences in Marseille. This novel is then followed by Au Pays, Mon Beau Peuple from 1957, and probably his most successful novel, Le Bout de Bois de Dieu from 1960. And indeed, he's a very prolific author from this point onwards. And he will actually adapt many of his own written works into films. So often he's kind of adopts this practice of writing a text, a novella, a short story, a novel, whatever, and then making a film on that basis. Rather rare practice, actually, that someone would adapt their own literary works to film, but this is the case for many of Sembene's films. In 1962, he gets a rare opportunity. He's accepted to the Vigik Film School in Moscow, which is, I would say at this time, the best film school in the world. The Soviets knew how to educate filmmakers. The model of Vigik was essentially that if you became a kind of, let's say an acknowledged filmmaker, part of your task then, I mean, you had basically just a salary as a filmmaker, and part of your task would be to teach at one of the Soviet film schools. And Vigik in Moscow was the principal film school. In the 1960s, it also was part of this kind of general Soviet educational drive to kind of, I guess, bring in people, like in the university system, to bring in people from third world countries and potential, let's say, third world allies to educate them. And then ideally, they would go back and kind of bring Marxism to their own countries. Sembene spent a year in Moscow at Vigik, studying under Mark Donskoy, himself a prolific filmmaker. And for this reason or for other reasons, he actually probably had his most consistent support internationally in the USSR for many, many years. And there were, his films were frequently, almost like, as a rule, shown at film festivals in the USSR, like Moscow and also Tashkent, which had a real focus on post-colonial cinema and cinema from what we would now call the Global South. And this was also very much a regular showcase of Sembene's work. So there is a kind of, he's tied to the French Communist Party, has his experiences in the Soviet Union. I mean, he's someone who becomes well-versed, let's say, in the Marxist movement. After departing from the gig, he starts to make his own films, principally filming them in Senegal itself. He starts off with 2 short films, Borom Sare and Niai, before making his first feature-length film, although it's a slightly short one, Le Noir d'Eux, also known as Black Girl in English, which is filmed partly in Senegal and partly in France. Filmed against Sembene's preferences actually in French. He wanted the film to be a combination of Wolof and French, and this was denied. The production money came from France, and this was denied by the producers. There's a very interesting result of that, though, which I think is actually quite effective, which we hear the voiceover of the... the film's protagonist is a servant, a kind of nanny figure from Senegal in a white European family. And to the family, she speaks very halting French, but the voiceover that we hear in her mind is this very literary, very, like, you know, articulate French that shows that, you know, she's actually far more intelligent than this family gives her credit for, who kind of treats her like a kind of minion and a kind of practically a slave. Mandabi is his follow-up to Le Noir d'Eux. Le Noir d'Eux actually is very successful and now is almost like an extremely canonical film for African cinema, or for world cinema in general. Mandabi follows it up. It's part of its claim to fame. First of all, it's an actual feature-length film in terms of 92 minutes long, filmed entirely in Senegal, almost entirely in Senegal. There's just a few short scenes in France, but also in the Wolof language, so the main language of Senegal. And for the first time, we have a feature-length film made by a Black African filmmaker in an indigenous African language, in this case, Wolof. Interestingly enough, the French, you know, again, the money came principally from France. Senegal was only just developing its own kind of film structures at this time. And the French producers also demanded a French language version of Mandabi. Which would be very interesting to watch. This is completely obscure. It was almost never been shown. It would be very interesting to watch this because part of the interest of the film, you know, a core element of the film is the interplay between Wolof and French that we see. You know, most of the film is in Wolof, but there are moments where it is kind of socially required to speak French, and the inability to do so is also a kind of, you know, let's say an issue. How the French dub manages this, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I haven't seen the French version. It's one of these weird little holy grails, maybe, to find out there. It reminds me a little bit, as a parenthetical remark, of the Italian dub of Le Mépris by Godard. Le Mépris is a film that's in 4 different languages, German, French, English, Italian. A major character in that film is a translator who's translating between all the different people speaking. And the Italian producers made an Italian dub of it where everyone speaks Italian. It's probably completely nonsensical. And I wondered to myself whether Mandabi, the French version of Mandabi, would be similar. Certainly, Sembene himself had no interest in disseminating that version of the film. But that's just a side remark. After Mandabi, he goes on to make many films. I have a list here: Emetai, Shala, Sedo, Comte de Tiawa, Gelwa, Fatkina, and then finally Mulade. In 2004, so kind of quite prolific in the late 60s and up until the late 70s. His filmmaking rate slows down a little bit. Mulade, though, was a real, on an international level, a real comeback for Sembene. It's a film that got a huge amount of play in kind of the global festival circuit and was kind of a very fitting swan song for him because he unfortunately died 3 years after that film was made. So that's a little bit about Sembene. And his life and work as a whole, but I really want to focus now in on the film that we'll be watching, Mandabi. Mandabi is a Wolofization of the French word mandat, which is French for money order. So we can see mandat, and then B is this kind of, I guess, the Wolof article that is appended to it. So it's already in the title, we get this kind of admixture of Wolof and French. In French release, it was just known as Le Mandat, and indeed it's based on a novella that was originally published in French by Ousmane Sembene, Le Mandat, which we see the cover of here, in 1965. So 3-year period between publishing this novel in French and then making the film that he wanted to make actually in Wolof. both the novella and the film represent an interesting shift in focus in Sembene's broader oeuvre, in terms of his literary and his cinematic oeuvre, which is a shift from a very direct attack on, let's say, French colonialism to more of a critique of the role of African elites in post-independence Africa, and in this case, in post-independence Senegal. Senegal having gained its independence in 1960. So this was still, it was still a very fresh social transformation, as I think we'll see a real focus of this film and of many films that Sembene makes from this point on, are the ways in which the logic of colonialism is retained and preserved, even in this, even in this supposedly kind of independent nation. There's still this kind of deeper lying dependency on this kind of French colonial legacy among the elites of Senegal. What I find very interesting about this particular film is the way it combines both comic and tragic registers. So there's a kind of, it's a funny film in many ways. It has kind of a farcical nature to it. On the other hand, its trajectory is a rather tragic one, as we'll see. Things don't go so well for our protagonist in Mandabi. The other thing to maybe think about, and I will return to this kind of towards the end of the lecture, is also the influence of Brechtian aesthetics on the film. I think this comes through very clearly in the final scene of the film, or the final sequence of the film. But I would also argue it has there is a kind of deep-lying Brechtianism throughout Mandabi, not in any kind of slavish or derivative way. I think anyone who tries to consciously do Brecht is going to do it badly. But the influences or the kind of, let's say, parallels, I would say, are definitely there. He was definitely aware of Brecht's work and of Brecht's kind of method. Going to go a little bit into the plot of Mandabi now to kind of give us a sense for the film, and I apologize for any spoilers in advance, but I think it's important to kind of get a full idea of what happens in this film. The main character of the film is this guy, Ibrahima Dieng. I think it would be a stretch to call him the hero of the film, because he's not much of a hero. He's, to be honest, a bit of a schlub. We can see him here. This is very, let's say, archetypal image of Ibrahima because he's kind of eating a dish, kind of sitting next to his bed. This is a man who loves nothing more than eating and sleeping. He's a very lazy guy. He's indolent. He's not particularly motivated. We can see also, he's well into middle age. He's corpulent. He's clearly, he's kind of not the fittest guy in the world. He's gone bald. This is not necessarily a figure of let's say audience adulation. Mystifyingly enough, though, he's in a marriage where he's the recipient of seemingly undying, doting devotion, and seemingly undeservedly. You wonder to yourself, what has he done to how does this happen? Now, some of you were here about a year ago for my lecture on Sima Bada by Satyajit Ray, where I talked about the protagonist of that film, Shai Malendu, and noted that there were some parallels that we could detect between Shai Malendu and a kind of cult figure in American television, namely Don Draper in Mad Men. Well, I think there are some parallels here also between our protagonist in Mandabi, Ibrahima Dieng, and this guy. He's Homer Simpson, basically. And in fact, I managed to find, if you look at this, the parallels between these images are pretty uncanny. They're both sitting in singlet and underpants, basically, just stuffing their mouths full of food while their, kind of spouse kind of looks on in a mixture of love and disgust. There is one key difference, though, between Ibrahima Dieng in Mandabi and Homer Simpson in The Simpsons, which is namely, strange enough, Ibrahima has two wives. Not one Marge Simpson, but two Marges. Matty and Aram, who, strange enough, seem, I mean, both kind of equally devoted to him without apparently any rivalry between each other at all. They both look after him. They kind of like attend to his every, they kind of alternate, attend to his every needs and so on and so forth. Lucky guy, he's got not one wife, but two. This was, let's say, I mean, bigamy was a practice that Sembene himself wasn't necessarily favorable towards, but in the interest of realism, he wanted to depict this side of Senegalese society at the time. I guess in modern day parlance, we would say he's in a polycule. This is Ibrahima's lot in life. Now things seem to be going okay for him. Granted, it's not perfect. He's been unemployed for 4 years, but that doesn't seem to bother him because a job would just interfere with his strict regime of sleeping all day and then eating whenever he's awake. But his life gets kind of turned upside down when the postman arrives one day and delivers a letter from his nephew. By the way, one other thing in the film is Ibrahim seems to have a lot of nephews. Basically, all of Dhaka is a nephew of Ibrahima, it seems sometimes in the film. One nephew of his is working in Paris, is actually earning some money by Senegalese standards at least, although he's very much at the bottom of the kind of Parisian social ladder, and has sent a money order back to Senegal that it's Ibrahima's task to cash out, to get the money and keep most of it for the nephew, just keep it safe, give some of it to his sister, his nephew's mother, and then he gets to keep a little bit for himself. It works out, the money order, and Sembene is actually in the whole film very, very precise with financial figures, which I think is also a very important thing to keep an eye out. The whole sum is for 25,000 Central African francs, or francs, I guess. I'm not sure it's Central, West African francs. Which in the literature I've been told is worth roughly $100 American, I guess at the time. We see, I mean, a bus fare is usually kind of said to cost 50 francs in the film, so we can maybe kind of compare it to that, how much money that actually is, but a considerable sum, certainly for someone like Ibrahima. But it's his task to basically cash this sum and keep a hold of it until his nephew comes back. There's only one problem though. Ibrahima goes to the post office to attempt to cash the sum, and they ask for ID. He doesn't have ID. He doesn't have a passport. He doesn't have a birth certificate. He has very little there to prove that he is who he actually is. He has an additional problem, which is that he is actually illiterate. So he can't even read. His nephew has also sent him a letter with instructions on what to do with this money order. He doesn't, he can't even read this letter. He needs someone else to read it. He elicits the services of, I guess, a profession that existed in Senegal at this time, namely a kind of a document reader for the illiterate part of the population, who would set up a little table, at least as the film depicts it, in kind of official buildings and, offer their services. If you need me to read a letter or a document or a bill or whatever, I can do it, and you just give me, I think he charges 50 francs or whatever. This character is actually played by Ousmane Sembene himself, interestingly enough. So he plays almost this kind of, let's say, debased intellectual. He's someone who has an education. He can read. He has the look of an intellectual here. But he's kind of, he's not writing great works of literature. He's sitting in this kind of, sitting in this stall, reading letters for people who, can't read them themselves. Interestingly enough, on his little table, he has a picture of none other than Che Guevara, recently martyred Argentinian revolutionary, obviously active in the Cuban Revolution, then goes to Congo, and then finally Bolivia, where he's murdered by the CIA. So we can possibly think that this character is also a politically engaged intellectual, or at least kind of is giving off this this image with this kind of big picture of Che on his table. He reads out the letter for Ibrahim. We then get what I think in the film is one of the, brilliant examples of montage in the film, which is we hear essentially Ousmane Sembene reading out the letter that Ibrahim's nephew has read to him, and then we get visions of this nephew's life in Paris while the letter is being read out. So we cut from the post office in Dhaka to the very easily recognizable Eiffel Tower, but then we get a pan down from this, the iconic image of the Eiffel Tower right down to the ground, where what we see is this guy carrying a broomstick, essentially. This is his job, is street sweeper on the streets of Paris. I think it's also very interesting that there's this. This also highlights Sembene's kind of visual sensibility. This kind of strange, visual rhyming between the broomstick and the Eiffel Tower. I find it like a very beautiful image. We go from this Eiffel Tower to this broomstick. They're basically the same shape. The brother goes to the post office in France, writes out the money order with this letter saying, basically explaining his life, saying there's no work for me in Senegal. I've had to come here to find whatever work I can get, earn some money so I can send it back and help out my family. This is a very archetypal immigrant story, essentially, that the nephew is giving. He's earning what by French standards would be an absolutely minimal wage, but still just scraping by as much as he can so that he can send as much money back to his loved ones in Dhaka. We see some images of his life in Paris. Here he is wearing very French clothing, riding the metro. This is also another little parenthesis. My son is incredibly obsessed with metros and metro maps. And because of this, I've been inspired to, I have this little research project bubbling away in the back of my mind to do a database of metro scenes in films. And then so now every time I see a metro scene in a film, I have a little document, I write it down in. So I was very happy to see this metro scene. I think it's a very good metro scene as well, because it shows this alienated experience of this man. He's left his family, he's left everyone he knew back in Dhaka, and he's kind of living, has the status of super exploited laborer, and is living this kind of solitary existence, in alienated existence in this kind of cold European city, riding the metro, looking out the window, kind of totally kind of bored and alienated. So Ibrahima doesn't have ID. His mission is then, and this takes up a lot of the rest of the film, is to essentially prove that he is who he is so that he can access this money that his nephew Abdul has sent to him. And this essentially takes the form of something of like a kind of bureaucratic wild goose chase. He's first told that he has to go to the police station where they can provide him with a passport. There he is told that he needs anyone who's dealt with the German Ausländerbehörde would probably start getting real trauma recurrences watching these scenes in the film. He's then told that in order to get passport, he needs a birth certificate, 3 photos and a 50-cent stamp. He doesn't have a birth certificate, so then he's told that he has to go to the town hall to issue his birth certificate. He goes to the town hall. They tell him, what month are you born in? He says, he has a document that has his birth date, but it says roughly 1900. So he doesn't even know really what month he's born in. The employees at the town hall, or this kind of civic bureau, are also completely blasé and unmotivated and unhelpful. Here they're reading the magazine Jeune Afrique rather than kind of helping people waiting in line, talking about the various business dealings they're involved in. So Ibrahim is a little bit stuck. He doesn't quite know what to do. He then goes and visits another nephew of his who very evidently lives in much nicer circumstances. Is wearing Western attire. Is very much connected within the kind of post-colonial administration in Senegal, and says, yeah, I can help you out. I'll give you a little check to tide you over, and then we'll work it out with getting you the birth certificate from the town hall. So it seems like, okay, he's getting somewhere, like not through official channels, but through this kind of like side channel through his nephew. This is, by the way, this kind of architectural reminder that all these kind of state institutions are really holdovers from the colonial era, including in their kind of built form. You know, just this is the town hall built by France, the Hôtel de Ville, built by the French colonial administration in the 19th or 20th century, and then, you know, the Senegalese post-colonial state apparatus just kind of moves right into the same building. He goes to cash the check given to him by his nephew. He also needs ID for that check. Finally, someone helps him out, but like they take a cut. So he's already even to get access to the money, he's starting to have to really like spend a lot of money. He goes to get his photo taken so that he can get the passport once his birth certificate comes through. It turns out the photo shop was just a big scam. They don't even have film in the camera. He comes back the next day for his photos, and they like just kind of refuse him. And when he gets upset about this, they essentially beat him up. So he's kind of, you know, being bled dry with money, but also kind of being like brutalized and kind of literally bleeding physically. He's kind of at its real genuine low point. At the same time, because word has gotten out that this money order has arrived for Ibrahim and his family, he's rich. He's got 25,000 francs on the way. Well, surely you can like lend me a few thousand francs. Like I'm in really desperate situations. So people are starting to ask him for money, borrow money from him. His wives are starting to spend the money that they don't necessarily have already. Eventually, as an interim measure, he pawns his necklace. He pawns one of his wives' necklaces, actually a gold necklace, a kind of wedding gift, a very personal item for her. But she says, that's okay, we'll get it back. Like it's fine. In the end, they don't get it back. He finally turns to another supposed nephew of his, although the familial relationship here seems particularly not so intimate, because this guy, Mbai, presents himself as this kind of businessman who has the right connections to finally make sure that the money order comes through. And his strategy is basically that Ibrahim gives him power of attorney so that he can then cash out the check by himself, and then he'll give Ibrahim the money back. He's his nephew, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, you'll find out, I guess. Interestingly enough, though, when Ibrahim visits his nephew, also in a much nicer house or apartment than Ibrahim himself lives in, who do we see on the wall? But another great, let's say, anti-colonial revolutionary leader, namely Patrice Lumumba. But again, here there's a kind of real irony to the presence of Lumumba's portrait. Lumumba, Congolese revolutionary, led the independence movement there before being assassinated roughly a year after independence by political rivals in the Congo who were working basically very tightly with the Belgian Secret Service and the CIA. They wanted him out. He was too radical. But the fact that this guy, this kind of very shady businessman who's clearly there to exploit and fleece Ibrahima, has, this kind of homage to Patrice Lumumba on the walls, perhaps also a kind of sign of Sembene's frustration with the post-colonial order. It's kind of, let's say, its legitimation through this kind of legacy of revolutionary struggle, the iconography of Che and Lumumba and so on and so forth, and the stark contrast with the actual reality of post-independence countries like Senegal, where the state, like this endemic state corruption and violence, are still absolutely rife. And someone like Ibrahima, who's like not the most lovable guy in the world, but still you end up having a lot of sympathy for his situation, just can't basically make any headway whatsoever. What I want to say now, though, is I'll come back to Mandabi, but I'm gonna take a little detour now. Hopefully, we have enough time for this. My argument about this film, though, is that it is part of, let's say, a mini genre in film history, which I would call capital flow films. This is a film where the narrative is not based on, let's say, traditional models that we would we'll be familiar with from, let's say, the bourgeois realist tradition of literature and cinema, but rather is structured much more along the lines of the circulation of, let's say, circulation of capital, essentially, circulation of currency, circulation of exchange values. And that is what structures this is a very episodic film. Seemingly, these episodes come a little bit at, a little bit in a fragmentary state or whatever, but what's really holding them together is actually the economic relations, the financial relations. They are the kind of, let's say, the cement or the glue of the narrative of Mandabi. I said there's a kind of, let's say, a little genre of films in this, that kind of do this. Let's say that are films of capital films. Probably the most famous one, though, is a film that didn't exist, namely the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein's attempt in roughly 1929-1930 to literally adapt Marx's Capital for the cinema. And not to do so with through any kind of narrative premise or whatever, but to use montage itself to depict, let's say, production relations and exchange relations. And Eisenstein was probably the smartest person who ever picked up a camera. He couldn't do it. He had to give up this project. He had to kind of accept failure, accept that it was essentially unrealizable. We can see, I think, in his earlier films, such as Strike, Battleship Potemkin, October, which this is an image from, and The General Line, certain moments in those films where there are attempts to depict social relations, economic relations, production relations through montage. This is the kind of famous Gods and Country sequence from October, which is probably the most abstract montage sequence in Eisenstein's work. Those are all little sketches, but to actually kind of cohere that into a whole film that would bring capital to the screen, Eisenstein couldn't pull it off. I think there are some interesting other parallel examples in film history where there are at least gestures towards this idea, if not a fully blown concept of adapting capital. We can go right back to D.W. Griffith's A Corner in Wheat from 1908. Very short film, but an incredible film. I mean, most people know Griffith as kind of Birth of a Nation and racism and so on and so forth. This film is a proto-Marxist film, whether Griffith was aware of it or not, and absolutely he was not aware of it. But already in Griffith, in this film, you see, let's say, the editing structure of the film show the class relations that are dominant in the society that he's depicting. Griffith was, of course, enormously influential for the Soviets, certainly for Eisenstein and Podovkin and Kuleshov, less so for Dziga Vertov, who was he's a bourgeois filmmaker because he does fiction still. But nonetheless, we see a similar gesture in moments in Vertov films. Here's A Sixth of the World, where he kind of shows these kind of global, let's say, extractive capital flows from the colonies to the kind of luxurious bourgeoisie of the First World. And again, precisely through doing montage, they're doing this kind of parallel editing between this exploited labor in the colonies and the kind of the life of luxury and excess in the First World. Marcel L'Herbier in France was not a Marxist, but in a film like L'Argent from 1928, I think he also kind of shows us this kind of let's say, the world of capital exchange, the world of stock markets and trading and so on and so forth in a very effective way. One thing uniting all these films is that they're all silent films, and perhaps silent cinema was somehow better able to do, or more capable of doing this kind of more abstract form of montage than sound cinema. But nonetheless, later, even in the sound cinema, we have some examples. Godard Grand's Lutte en Italie from 1969 is an attempt really to kind of adapt Althusser to the screen. We also see certain relations, production relations, in the film. indeed, the film has a lot of kind of black, just like moments of black screen that then, you know, the filmmakers go, why is this black screen there? And it's like, because it was masking the true thing that was combining all these other images, which was namely images of relations of production, workers in the factory, like, you know, working at their machines and so on and so forth. So we have this in Lutte Italy. Could also argue the much better known film Tout va bien has similar relations between a kind of sausage factory and then later scenes in the supermarket and so on and so forth. We can even think of maybe later masterpieces of, let's say, Marxist economic cinema, like John Landis's Trading Places from 1983, starring Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy. One of the best films in terms of like giving us the reality of capitalist economics that there really is, and also a very intersectional film as well, because it kind of shows the confluence precisely of race and class. One of Eddie Murphy's real masterpieces. And I'm very proud that I've now had references to Homer Simpson and Eddie Murphy in my lecture on Ousmane Sembene. So I would kind of slot Mandabi into this little genre of films, but right now I want to get in a little bit into what I mean when I bandy these terms about, or like, you know, economic relations, exchange values, and so on and so forth. Hopefully it's obvious now I'm making reference to Marx and Engels' writings, and in particular their analysis of the functioning of capitalism. Which they deliver in, you know, a huge number of their texts, but most notably, of course, the 3 volumes of Capital, of which the first volume was completed in Marx's lifetime, and then Engels. And, you know, the first volume is also, I would argue, a profound work of literature. It's an extremely literary work. The following 2 volumes were published by Engels on the basis of Marx's notes and don't necessarily have that same flair to them, much more like straight down the line. I mean, Volume 1, it has all these references to Shakespeare and Goethe and Dante, and it's also very, like, just beautifully written. But even as early as the Communist Manifesto from 1848, really the kind of, you know, the clarion text by Marx and Engels, you already, like in the, you know, opening pages of this text, you have a very clear connection in their concept and almost their history of the emergence of capitalism as a social formation of, let's say, the central role played by the colonial conquest of, or by Europe of the rest of the world in the development of capitalism. So this is something that people often say, like, oh, well, there's like, you had Marxist theory, and then like later there was this kind of colonialist theories that like use Marx, but this was already present already as early as 1848 in Marx and Engels. So already in the Communist Manifesto, they talk about how the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, navigation, industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. So it was really the act of conquering these colonial territories that gave this kind of turbocharge to this kind of nascent mercantile capitalism that existed in the kind of early modern era. And it's that enabled capitalism to really become the dominant social formation, the dominant mode of production. If there hadn't been that kind of turbocharge, it may not have actually been able to kind of overtake this kind of old feudal order. They also talk about the, let's say, in this very famous passage, the replacement of, let's say, prior social relations through this kind of these pure economic exchanges that capitalism brings about. So the bourgeoisie, whenever it has got the upper hand, this is a little later in the Communist Manifesto, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation, which resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible, chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. This is the tendency of capitalism. and as they very famously say, all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. And this is essentially also what we see in Mandabi. We see the way that all of the relations in the film are essentially economic relations, and is also essentially like kind of rapacious economic relations. Everyone is out to basically squeeze money out of everyone else. And there's very few exceptions of that in the film. And it's this kind of, let's say, a dog-eat world that is depicted here. The film is kind of littered, I think this is very interesting, with these images that seemingly have very little to do with the narrative, but what essentially they do is show this kind of constant process of exchange taking place, commodity exchange in particular, of kind of the buying and selling of goods and services. We just see constantly this constant movement in the film as well. Everyone is on the move. Everyone is going somewhere. Everyone is buying something, selling something. There's this kind of constant mobility and flux that we see. This is the all that is solid melts into air kind of side of the film. We'll get though. What I also thought is kind of almost emblematic of the film is also the cultural practice of head carrying that we see also throughout the films, that people kind of carrying large baskets or bowls on the top of their head, almost as this kind of like, Marx would say, like goods don't circulate themselves. They need people to circulate them, right? This is not this is not a process that's just taking place on this kind of automated basis. It's kind of like they need these kind of vehicles to undergo this kind of circulation process, this exchange process. Commodity exchange and let's say capital circulation in general is a process that Marx kind of gives a pair of economic formulas. And this is also very important for him in terms of distinguishing, let's say, the exchange of capital with kind of earlier forms of commodity exchange. Here we have what he kind of calls the base formula for commodity exchange, which is CMC. In the German, this would be VGW, which is commodity, money, commodity. Ware, Geld, Ware. Which is a kind of pre-capitalist mode of exchange. Marx says, like, I have all this corn. What am I going to do with this corn? I don't want corn. I want wine. That guy has some wine. Well, I could like change some of my corn for some of his wine. But then we have to figure out like how much corn should I give for his wine and so on and so forth. So then gradually as a society, we developed this thing called money, which is the kind of, you know, the kind of basic exchange platform, let's say. So now what I can do is and I don't even have to sell the corn to him directly. I can sell the corn to anyone. That's the commodity. Get some money for it, and then use that money to buy another commodity that maybe I want a little bit more than all this corn I have. So I get this other commodity in exchange for that. This is the CMC process. The thing about this is, in the end, this is good for like exchange purposes. If someone wants something a bit more than someone else or whatever, that's all very good. But it doesn't increase wealth in any way. I have this, me and this other guy together after the end of this, you know, whole exchange process, we still have the same amount of corn and wine that we had at the start. Nothing has really changed there. We've like exchanged things a little bit, but there's been no economic growth. We're basically where we started at in terms of a social totality. So CMC doesn't really get us anywhere. And indeed, for much of human history, that's all that basically, you know, exchange was. It was kind of like basic form of commodity exchange that didn't like, you know, generate any kind of economic growth whatsoever. So Marx contrasts this with his alternative formula, which we get with the capitalist mode of production, which is MCM apostrophe. And the apostrophe here is very important. This is money, commodities, money. But not just money, commodities, money, because what's happened here, this little apostrophe means after this process, I've got a little bit more money than I started with. My capital has grown. I'm a successful capitalist. I've exchanged my existing capital for a bundle of commodities that I've then been able to kind of sell off for more money than I originally started off with. I've made profit. I've, cracked the code of capitalism. The problem here is, well, what commodities did I actually buy to go from this M here to this bigger M over there? As Marx would say, like, if you just cut out the commodity bit, all you then have is M to M apostrophe. You have money, somehow magically becomes more money. What kind of magical commodity is this that can give me more money than I started off with? Now, if I'm a, clever, like, whatever, maybe I can, like, work out some deals and so on and so forth, and that's how I get more money. But again, if you look at the social totality, that's not going to help the, let's say, capital as a whole grow. If I've got more money, then that's because I've just fleeced someone else. There has to be some kind of commodity out there that actually kind of grows capital in itself. By the way, just as a side note, in capitalism, this is a kind of infinite process, because as soon as I have more money, then I exchange it for more commodities and then get even more money and so on and so forth. So it just keeps going on. It's not a closed process. It's an open dialectic. But again, this question, what kind of commodity can I buy, can I purchase, that I can then sell for more capital, for more money than I originally had? Marx comes up with an answer to this question. In order to be able to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags, his name for Mr. Capitalist, must be so lucky as to find within the sphere of circulation in the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption, therefore, is itself an embodiment of labor and consequently a creation of value. Luckily, there is one commodity that is like this. The possessor of money does find on the market such a special commodity in Marx's words, capacity for labor or labor power. Namely, if I buy, and Marx is very clear, what I'm doing here is buying the labor power of the worker, not necessarily the labor. Labor power is the capacity to labor. That is, I'm essentially paying the worker to stay alive and have enough energy so that they can actually work for me, and the worker has to take that because they have no other choice. Then I can actually get the worker to produce more goods than I've actually paid for their labor power. And then suddenly I found that I've made profit. I've kind of produced what Marx would call surplus value. But I haven't done so through my own work or labor or activities or whatever, but through the exploited labor power of this worker that I've hired. So what's very important here is that what kind of embeds or undergirds this kind of capital circulation, this flow of exchange values, which seemingly to us, it's like people invest in the stock market and then like 6 months later, like their stocks are higher, and it's like, oh wow, that's like somehow it's this magic. That's just happened in this kind of weird financial world that we don't know anything about. But what really underpins that is actually always production, and production based on this kind of exploited labor power. So as he writes, the consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity outside the limits of the market or the sphere of circulation. Accompanied by Mr. Moneybags and by the possessor of labor power, we therefore take leave for a time of this noisy sphere where everything takes place on the surface and in view of all men. We all know about the stock market, about Wall Street, about Frankfurt or whatever. We all hear about that all the time. Every news report has the stock results and everything. And follow them both into the hidden abode of production. Production is outside of our view. We don't see what's going on, like actually behind the gates of the factories and so on and so forth. And now, those factories will be on the other side of the planet. On whose threshold there stares us in the face no admittance except on business. Even if we wanted to see into these factories, we wouldn't be allowed to. Here we shall see not only how capital produces, but how capital is produced. We shall at last force the secret of profit making. So it's really come through production, through this kind of the labor process. So as Marx will then kind of outline in volume 2 of Capital, what on the surface appears to be this kind of MC/M apostrophe is actually this more complicated process where we have MC, so money, commodities, then some more commodities, and then more money, and in the middle of that is P, production. And that's the hidden element of this kind of capital exchange flows. In particular, this is kind of a little bit of a sidetrack, but this exchange of commodities in particular takes the form of on the one hand labor, and on the other hand the means of production, which under capitalism are kind of separated from each other. And that's why I as a capitalist, am able to exploit the labor of these workers, because I have the means of production and they don't. All they have is their labor power. Volume 3 of Capital, I'm really like scooting right through all the volumes now. Marx comes to the question of credit. And I think it's also important for Mandabi because what we see is essentially someone who has kind of unwittingly received a line of credit. Ibrahima at no point in the film has the 25,000 francs in his hands. He just has this note that says he is due to get 25,000 francs when he goes to the post office with, you know, the requisite ID. He's essentially being granted credit. It was only in Capital, in Volume 3 of Capital, that Marx really kind of starts thinking about what effect credit can actually have on capital circulation. It was kind of a bit of a puzzle for him as well for a long time. So it's kind of, what he was saying was a little, even at this point, still a little bit provisional. But he notes a kind of dual effect of credit in capital circulation. On the one hand, it serves to accelerate capital flows because I don't have to wait till this whole production process is taking place and I got my money back and got some profit before I then invest it again. I can draw credit and accelerate the process much more rapidly. On the other hand, it leads to the formation of stock companies, which we would call the kind of financialization of capital. So instead of being an individual capitalist who individually owns a factory and employs workers and goes to the factory every day and like looks down at them like from my office, I'm just basically someone who has a stock portfolio. In Marx's words, and I don't even know what's in this portfolio a lot of the time. I just know that the numbers are looking good and so on and so forth. For Marx, this is the transformation of the actually functioning capitalist into a mere manager, administrator of other people's capital, and of the owner of capital into a mere owner, a mere money capitalist. It's no longer this kind of like the figure of the bourgeoisie in the kind of classic 19th century, or the figure of the bourgeois in the classic 19th century sense. For Marx, this is the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, and hence a self-dissolving contradiction which prima facie represents a mere phase of transition to a new form of production. It manifests itself as such a contradiction in its effects. It establishes a monopoly in certain spheres and thereby requires state interference. It reproduces a new financial aristocracy, a new variety of parasites in the shape of promoters, speculators, and simply nominal directors, a whole system of swindling and cheating by means of corporate promotion, stock issuance, and stock speculation. And essentially also this is what we're seeing here. We're seeing this kind of whole apparatus of parasites that essentially like kind of descend onto Ibrahima to kind of like extract money from him. I want to go through this very quickly because I've already spoken for way too long. What I think is interesting here is that in Mandabi we get this kind of heightened level of abstraction in the guise of kind of what this kind of access to capital actually is. It's no longer gold, silver. It's not even money in the sense of coins or banknotes. It's just this kind of promissory note that says like you're due for some money. In that sense, this is kind of like the latest phase of the kind of financialization of capital. Interestingly enough, though, we also see at the same time these kind of earlier forms of exchange values in the film. Notably, and I find this very interesting, rice is basically used as an alternative mode of currency in the film. They're often buying and selling kilograms of rice as kind of basically as this kind of basic currency. Ibrahima will often go to this kind of general store where he's kind of being sold rice, which he can then buy and sell and so on and so forth. And I think it's also very interesting that this shop owner, he's getting lines of credit from the shop owner as well, talks about the rice saying it's just really good. You got to try this rice. It's like really good rice. You've never had rice like this before. He says, literally says here, this is the Black Atlantic cinema moment, Vincent. It's not from France. It's not from America. It's straight from Indochina. That's where you get the good rice. So this is like the whole globalized structure of commodity exchange now has been shown to us in this kind of neighborhood store on the outskirts of Dhaka. So we get these kind of the presence of global capital flows now. We obviously had the note coming from France. We get the rice circulating all across the world. What's notable, though, in Mandabi is that the production process, such as we see it, the nephew working in Paris, is taking place in the metropole, in France, and not in the colonies. Senegal seems to be denoted by a lack of work. Everyone, Ibrahima hasn't worked for 4 years. His nephew's left because there's no work for him. The production is all taking place in the imperialist centers, and the colonies are kind of, let's say, almost underworked. In this case, the film also gives us a very early example, or a very early filmic treatment of the economic phenomenon of remittances, which is namely, now it's massive. I mean, in 1968, it was still a very small economic phenomenon, and has simply exploded in prevalence in recent years or decades, in the sense that it's kind of migrant workers from the global south go to the global north, like even though they're really earning the lowest wages in that society, that's still enough that they can send back to their family. It's kind of almost an extra level of exploitation that they suffer. And this is a chart showing us the rate of remittances compared to foreign aid. Western countries aren't we so generous? We're giving all the hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid to all these poor countries in Africa and Asia and so on and so forth. But actually that sum is dwarfed by the amount of money that is actually going back on the backs of super exploited migrant workers in the first world countries. This is like one of the world's biggest economic kind of let's say global circulations of capital. The problem with essentially Ibrahima is that he's something of a failed capitalist. Instead of MCM working the way it should, which is he starts with money, exchanges it for commodities, he then ends up with more money at the end. All that's happening to him is throughout the film, he's getting less and less money. He's losing money. He's basically being cheated out of his, the money that was supposed to come to him and is clearly never going to end up coming to him at all. So this process, it's not going back to CMC. He's still participating in this kind of MCM apostrophe process, but in a negative form. The capital is decreasing, getting smaller more and more. Why does this happen to our poor protagonist Mandabi? Well, Bourdieu and Passeron in their book Reproduction possibly have an answer, which is they talk about additional forms of capital, not just economic capital, but cultural, social, symbolic capital. Which are characterized by the fact that they adhere to the same logic as economic capital, the same kind of growth dynamic and monopolization tendencies and so on and so forth. But they're also, in a certain degree, convertible into economic capital. If you have cultural capital, you're actually more likely to have more economic capital. And if you don't have that cultural capital, you're more likely to lose any economic capital that you might have. So a lack of these forms of capital can actually inhibit the accumulation of economic capital. We could then argue that Ibrahima's tragedy is his lack of cultural capital. He's illiterate, he has no work ethic, he's naive, he doesn't understand how money works, he's ignorant of the habitus, as Bourdieu would say, of financial and governmental institutions. On the other hand, he does have these seemingly familial and social connections that enable him to grease the wheels a little bit. He also owns his own house, albeit in a kind of parlor estate here. So he's not totally devoid of cultural capital. And it's important to note too, he's not denoted as a proletarian in the film. He's something more like a kind of déclassé bourgeois. He's part of this kind of bourgeois class, but it's kind of lost his capital, frittered away his capital. Doesn't have the right skills to, let's say, increase his capital. Similar to the character of Oblomov in the Russian novel by Ivan Goncharov. We could possibly then turn to Althusser, and I'll end on this point, to explain Ibrahim's failure as a capitalist. Namely, his failure comes down to an inability to be interpolated as a subject. What does Althusser mean by this? He talks about the role of ideology in society as reproducing the conditions of production. It's what essentially it keeps workers going to work, let's say, because they believe there's no alternative, nothing else they can do. This also leads to the formation of ideological state apparatuses, courts, parliaments, churches, media, whatever. And the part of the function of these institutions, these ideological state apparatuses, is to interpolate, as I'm a victim of autocorrect here, because that should be interpellate, not interpolate, individuals into subjects. Which is to say, instead of just being this free spirit out in the world, you're actually part of a society. And you have to basically recognize that you're part of this society, you're given a kind of identity, you're given subjectivity, essentially. Althusser talks about this mythical scene of the policeman who sees someone walking down the street and then shouts out, "Hey, you there!" And that's all he has to say for that person to recognize that that policeman is yelling out at him, and then you turn around like, what did I do? It's like, you've just been interpolated by this state apparatus. The policeman has, you've recognized that the policeman was talking to you. This is a mythical scene because this process, no one has ever, like, I mean, this process has always already taken place in Alceste's view. There's an entire development of state apparatuses to manage this interpolation of the individual as a subject. And Ibrahima's tragedy is perhaps really that he suffers from having not been adequately interpolated by the nascent Senegalese state. He wasn't given the right documentation. He is not fully recognized as a participant in the social and economic structure of post-independence Senegal, which is this kind of society that is still at the crossroads between modern and pre-modern social modalities. In a country like Germany, it's impossible to be in Ibrahim's situation if you have citizenship, at least. If you're kind of perhaps a migrant, you're in a different situation. But you have to have a birth certificate, a passport, an unmeldung, and so on and so forth. Like, the German state doesn't give you that option. In Senegal, that infrastructure was still being developed at this point, and people slipped through the cracks, and this happened to Ibrahim. My last point, and I'll end on this, is to loop back to the kind of question of the film's Brechtian influence. Ask ourselves, is Mandabi a Brechtian film? Well, we can see certain parallels of plays of Brecht. I would note particularly Der gute Mensch von Szechuan and Muttercourage und ihre Kinder, showing kind of people's envelopment in these kind of exploitative economic relations. The most obviously Brechtian moment in the film, though, comes at the end, where the postman who originally delivered the money order comes back and addresses not just Ibrahima, but through the magic of cinema, also the viewer. And in this case, he's addressing very specifically a Senegalese viewer. We have this scene. Postman returns to Ibrahim and his two wives. Ibrahim goes on this tirade about how decency has become a sin in this country, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to become a wolf among wolves. Like, forget it, you know, I'm just going to join all these kind of rapacious swindlers who kind of deceive me out of my own money. But the postman's response is to say, this is the postman speaking, although we still see Ibrahima on screen, don't do that. Instead, we're going to change the country. Who's going to change this country? You, your wives, your children, and me. We're going to change things. This is the message of the postman. This is the kind of the militant, political, consciousness-raising message that we get at the end of the film. This is the Brechtian moment of kind of directly addressing the viewer. We're all together, we're going to change this rotten society and bring about this kind of, you know, a new society in its place. There's a little problem here, though, which is what I want to end with. I guess the question here is, how seriously are we to take this moment? Or is this just too ironically presented to us for us to even give it any credence? I mean, this is a question. I don't have any firm answer one way or the other at the moment, but I'd like to pose that question for you, and maybe we can discuss it after the film. So that was my presentation. I hope that all made sense. What I would say is, lastly, a final message. If you're ever feeling down and like life is just getting too much and you wonder like, what am I even doing here? Like, what is the meaning of it all? Just crack open Capital. It really does the trick. It really helps you in a tough spot. I can attest to that. So, you know, it's only 900 pages, so it's like just slightly longer than my own book. So we'll break for about 10 minutes, I guess, and then watch the film.
Okay. Speaking of money, the first thing we should probably mention is that this was a hugely commercially successful film in Senegal and other places as well, to the point where it made the career of Ousmane Sembene possible and sustainable. And it was also a moment where it seemed like a popular African cinema was going to be possible. But then one of the restrictions that kicked in was, of course, that the a French-owned distribution company basically controlled theatrical distribution across West Africa, and anyone who wanted to make films in Africa remained dependent on them, even if they wanted to have access to African screens. And incidentally, you probably saw this. This is a very nice restoration, and it was brought to us by Studio Canal Plus. Which is now, once again, as a French company, the biggest player in distribution across the African continent. And they're actually buying their way into Nigeria as well. So the struggles that Sembene had with his films, even when they were very, very successful, are bound to continue and actually continue and expand into the Anglophone part of West Africa as well. But what we should keep in mind is that this film resonated massively with audiences, and not just in Senegal. Sembene has this wonderful little anecdote where he's invited to a Zaire, to a congress, but also to a screening of the film, and there's this gentleman who basically camps out in his hotel lobby and chases him down, wants to talk to him, just to tell him that this exact same story happened to him in real life. And so it seems to be.
Did he sue him then for like the rights to his story?
No. He just wanted to share it. He just wanted to say, we all share the same story, and that's the funny part of it is that Patrice Lumumba's portrait is on the wall of the gangster. But yeah. Please.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, Charlotte was also extremely popular, so he was able to tap into a kind of popular thirst for seeing, like, I mean, in Senegal and in the region, for just seeing daily life on screen and seeing like people speaking their own language and living through stories that they themselves experience, as that anecdote you relate shows. But I thought it was also interesting that in 1973, then there's this very famous Congress of Third World filmmakers in Algiers, and they put out this manifesto of their kind of like their goals, and there were four international co-productions among nations of the Third World, but not, and very expressly not with imperialist nations.
Oh yeah,
that was like their real concrete demand was no more co-productions with France, UK, USA, Germany, or whatever, because that is a new form of exploitation, new form of extraction of the wealth that we're creating as filmmakers, and a new form of dependency. Like, it's a film. He makes a film. It's extremely popular. That money isn't going back into West African cinema. It's going to Paris, to the offices of the CNC or the private financiers or whatever. And now Canal Plus evidently is getting their cut of the pie as well. So this is something I think that Sembene and his fellow filmmakers were very aware of, that they needed to create an economic alternative to this kind of need for, I mean, in his case, French production money to actually make the films, because it's a dead end for them.
I mean, a key point in the '73 Algiers Manifesto is that that the filmmakers basically assigned the task of creating film industries to the post-colonial nation state. And the one place in Africa where that sort of happens is Nigeria, but they didn't solve the problem of distribution either. Ultimately, it was the Nollywood filmmakers who did solve the problem of distribution. And then we had the 30-year period where the industry was, where they made hugely popular films. Contrary to Sembene's films, they never made it to Western festivals, but they're enormously popular across Africa. But now, since it's become a very lucrative business, all of a sudden you have European players coming back into the market and actually buying up the distribution structures. So we'll see, we're seeing a bit of a repeat here. But let's talk about the film. So you offered a sort of a Marxian analysis what's going on, and I want to launch a small provocation. Africa had markets before capitalism arrived. Africa had slavery before transatlantic slavery arrived. 13, 12 centuries of it, actually, and particularly across West Africa and the Sahara. And you could also describe what we see in the film as a clash between two different sets of economies. And one thing that the film appears to be showing is that not all that is solid melts into air in this particular place, because what's really remarkable is that at the point where the women put out the rumor / lie that the money had been lost or that it had been stolen, there's a complete reversal of people's economic attitudes. Rather than come and beg and hoping to get their share of the wealth that suddenly had arrived from Paris, there was a system of solidarity where suddenly everyone is bringing them whatever they have to sustain them. And then when they have a little rice again, everyone comes and wants their share. So that's a very different economy from the capitalist economy, and it seems to persist, even in the face of comprador, bourgeoisie, exploitation. So how does that fit into your analysis?
No, that's a good point. Well, I'd say that, I mean, there are these little glimmers of a kind of, let's say, utopian alternative to this kind of dog-eat-dog system that seems to be implanting itself into Senegal. The process isn't completed, and it's interesting when you get those moments. You get that gesture when people think, oh, this guy's lost all his money, let's give him some food or whatever. And I mean, clearly, because he said, I mean, this is also a question. He's been unemployed for 4 years. This is not a country of a welfare state. He's not, he's not getting Arbeitslosengeld every month. So there's something that's keeping him going. Like somehow there's a kind of community network there that still has remained. I also found the moment when he gets into an altercation with the photography shop owner or scam owner or whatever interesting, because then there is a kind of community response to that violence against him. That is also an interesting moment, which I find in the logic of the film a little bit unexpected. Like, it took me by surprise that Sembene shows people actually come to Ibrahima's defense at that moment and say, hey, this is an old guy, like, why'd you beat him up? So he hasn't, all is not lost, or all hasn't, not yet everything has melted into air. And then I would say also, for me, the other interesting element of the film, and this for me is really the true, let's say, utopian alternative that the film offers, is the relationship between the two wives. Because I find their relationship very interesting. There's no like enmity or rivalry there. They seem very like loving and close to each other, not just to Ibrahim. I mean, they're kind of slavishly devoted to Ibrahim, strangely enough. But I feel like they would be much better off if they just got rid of this guy and stayed with each other. Like, there's this kind of what Marx would call a community of women already establishing itself there. I mean, they clearly have to. I mean, they're clearly going through the same thing of trying to make ends meet in this like dire situation, but that kind of brings them together rather than like pulling them apart. I found that also very interesting, the relationship between the two wives. There's almost a kind of radical feminist separatism going on there, like under the surface.
Not entirely sure I agree. I mean, but I mean that will be a long discussion. But it's important that this is a Muslim family, and it's a Muslim neighborhood. In a predominantly Muslim country, and so you could say that the father is sort of useless. Ibrahima is pretty useless. He's like an Oblomov without the possessions.
I mean, he owns the house still, And this is the thing.
Yeah, but there's no revenue. And,
there's no revenue coming in.
And Oblomov has, has land and he has revenue, but he's
too lazy
too lazy to work, and he's wasting it. So Ibrahima is very much like Oblomov, but in a very different society and without proper means. But for the women, I don't think it will be a reasonable and possible scenario to just get rid of him and start their own.
No, that's why it's utopian in a sense. I don't think it's a realistic scenario.
I don't see how Sembene is telling us that would be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he comes out in interviews after film saying I'm like anti-bigamy and anti-polygamy and so on and so forth. But he doesn't show it as being a particularly like horrible thing or whatever. I don't know. The critique in the film is not issued against that relationship.
But you can also construe it as a critique of a certain type of backwardness of the uneducated Muslim man. I mean, part of the reason why the film resonated so strongly, I guess, with audiences is that it's a very complex piece in terms of the characterization of people and their relationships, and it's not simplistic, I would say, in its analysis. But what's your take? Didi, come on.
You have to adjudicate now between our positions.
I think part of the thing actually is to situate the film properly. Of course, the Western concept of feminism, black women, and I mean black women of the world, black radical feminists, are opposed, they were and are still opposed to the concept of white women's idea of feminism. When, for instance, white women were campaigning, struggling for the right to work, black women, black radical feminists were outside of that struggle because black women have always been working. Even for white women, they have been working in white women's houses. So when white women were talking about the right to work, black women felt so alienated. What do you mean? We have been working for you. You have just woke up now for the right for women to work, but we as black women, we have been working. So you have to also understand the concept of polygamy. In an agrarian society, polygamy was a natural necessity because you could not employ labor because of the development of productive forces. You could not employ any other person. Your family were your laborers. So the bigger the family, the more you have. And to make the family bigger, you have to also get wives. And the more wives you have also, the more children you have, and the more hands you have to work at the factories. So the concept of polygamy within a historical period in time is necessary to be taken into consideration in approaching this film. Also, how Sembene approached it from the modern conception of bigamy. Oh, how should you have more? In the agrarian society I grew up in, the idea of a man having more than one wife and the wives cohabiting in peace was not really strange. It was normal because they needed each other for the sake of the family. And the reason why the man appeared to be jobless was because developing society rendered him jobless. It is like the Tuaregs, the Shua Arab people who beg in Lagos in Nigeria. We always make fun of the men. They were not working. The women beg money. The men are just sitting down. The women will beg money and come and hand it over to the men. The men were usually not jobless. It was the desert encroachment that nullified their means of livelihood. Then they found themselves in the city, and there was nothing they could do. The means of livelihood in the city was totally different from their means of survival in their usual habitat until the desert came. So it is necessary to situate the joblessness also of the man that, like Marx said, if money came into the world with a congenital blood stain on one part of the cheek, capital came dripping from head to toe from every post with blood and death. The arrival of money was in the arrival of money as capital and was what is ruining the livelihood of the people. and it has turned all relationships asunder. So I think that there is and should be also. I'm a Marxist, so always I approach. I cannot help it. This is who I am. So always also I have to approach certain things with from the point of view of dialectical materialism and from the point of view of Marxism. So I think also, but also there is the danger actually also in always trying to always make taking Marxism directly from an economic and political application into cultural and artistic application. So it's also a dangerous situation. So I think that this film actually, practically every African filmmakers who are radical, who I know, always claim that this is the most important. And I think I agree, this is the most important film for in terms of African film history. So this is what Sembene did. So he said Sembene was the one who took the burden for African filmmakers. So, and it impacted his films. Oftentimes in place of aesthetics, he submitted, he used social message at the expense of aesthetic. But I think this is a very beautiful aesthetic film. So, and I think that the messages are so subtle and there, because look at what the nationalists, the people who are coming over, the one with the picture of Che Guevara, they were coming in and they were making statements with the liberation struggle, but they were ripping off the people. So, and I think the film was making this beautiful, capturing it so very, very fine, so very, very beautiful, so very beautiful in it. So, and it's like you are talking about thought cinema and conference and all. It is also important for us to know that that thought cinema conference happened at the time in which Stalinism has made its peace with capitalism. So it was a period of coexistence. And usually the shortcoming of thought cinema is in failing to take into consideration that you cannot decolonize the world without overthrowing capitalism. So, and it reflected in all the product of third cinema. It was a crisis. How do you coexist with the system that has created wealth on one part of the world, and it has created poverty in the other part of the world? And this actually is also the shortcoming of Brecht. He made his peace with Stalinism, and then he wrote that book, The Measures Taken, defending all the crimes of Stalinism. So I approached this film a little bit more from the point of view of third cinema, and done a little bit of Brecht, which I think that in the shortcoming of the film also is contained a criticism of the Brechtian style of what to do, aesthetics, its distancing effect, and all that. So I think third cinema, so to say, seems to run its gamut without completing its mission, and it is inevitable because practically all the third cinema advocates have really not considered the implication of how do you have so-called communism or socialism existing alongside capitalism. How do you transform the system without also thinking in terms of taking the full implication of what third cinema said with Solanas and that you have got to transform the society by overthrowing capitalism. So the idea of Brecht and all those third world radicals of trying to coexist with capitalism always inherently impact the films that they made. But I think this is a very beautiful film. But I am curious. I want to ask you the question I wanted to ask you from the very beginning. Why do you explain this film? Because when cinema came to us as in the third world, it came as a colonial weapon with an interpreter interpreting the film for us before we see it. And I'm curious, why do you interpret the films we are going to see for us? Are you under the impression that the film is not conveying its message properly, so you need to interpret it for us before we see it?
Oh, Didi, that's a very mean question. I don't know. I should just quit my job as a film studies scholar right now, if that's the case. No, I just throw some ideas.
The inherent colonialism of the Cine Club format. Yeah. This is like 13 years in, finally.
Finally, we've realized that that we've been just going down the wrong path the whole time. I mean, I throw ideas out there. You don't need to believe them or take them at face value if you don't want to. But what I would say, a couple of responses. I mean, I hope that was helpful with my lecture for a little bit. But a couple of responses I would say. I mean, I think the first kind of comments you're making are very important because I presented this idea of the film, this kind of narrative structure being based on this kind of capital flows. If that's all it was, it would be a very dry academic exercise. But that's not, I mean, like what my lecture didn't really account for was the sheer beauty of the film, the real kind of sensuous qualities of the film, the use of colors. I mean, even to, it was already, this is his first color film, Sembene's first color film. And it was rare to shoot in color in Africa because of the expense at the time. But he makes so much of the colors in the film, I think really spectacular. And I think the restoration does a good job of showing that. But also I would say just the density of life that we see, particularly in these kind of interlude shots, that don't really, often aren't necessarily required by the narrative, but they really ground what's happening in the plot of the film in this kind of very concrete reality of Dakar at this particular moment. And we see this kind of world, we see the streets, the life, the crowds, the movement and the kind of constant intercourse of bodies in a very, I think, like visually, like just stunning manner. I think that's, he's a real filmmaker. He's not just kind of doing it's not an abstract kind of schema for Sembene. He's really, a master of visual effects. In this case. So that's something that I would definitely echo, and that maybe I didn't emphasize so much in my lecture. I think on the question of militant cinema, I mean, absolutely, it's fundamental to understand this film also in the context of third cinema, of this kind of international movement, I would say really internationalist movement as well, of filmmakers. There's a kind of tricontinental cinema movement, let's say, across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and they were very much in contact with each other and dialogue with each other and organizing, precisely doing things like these conferences and manifestos and so on and so forth. So this was a real, and they were also aware, I think, very conscious of the need for these kind of, to develop these organizational structures. And in the end, they weren't really, there were a lot of grand plans and not much follow-up, unfortunately. But at least the kind of vision to be I'm not just an individual filmmaker making my own films, but I'm actually part of a bigger filmmaking tendency that is also part of a bigger, global social struggle, essentially, which is about overthrowing not just colonialism, but then imperialism, the kind of even post-colonial forms of dependency. I think Sembene was a very key figure in that, very obviously, indisputably. That said, would you categorize this film as a militant film? And I think I did teach this film a couple of years ago in a course on Third World militant cinema, but I don't know. Is it? I mean, is this different from, we saw a couple of weeks Terror of the Time. That's a militant film. That is, and that's very much modeled on Hour of the Furnaces. It's almost a kind of archetypal third cinema film. This kind of really direct address to the viewer. This attempt to not just kind of educate the viewer about a political reality, but also kind of mobilize and kind of inspire to take political action. And there, as I noted in my lecture, there's a gesture to that right at the end of the film. But I don't know how much to take that at face value given everything else we've seen in the film. Ibrahima, he's not necessarily a character. He's not the kind of Zdanovian positive hero, let's say. He's an everyman, definitely. But he doesn't seem, you know, his take is that I should become a wolf among wolves out of it, which is basically I should just become a better capitalist. And then we have the postman giving him the proper political message. But is he really going to take that on board? Is he going to have this like consciousness raising moment? I don't necessarily think so. And I think if the audience, like, is the audience supposed to get that? Or is this, I mean, is this film too laid in this kind of irony and satire and kind of farce to really work as a militant film? That would be my question.
Diddy has a response to it, but I just want to throw out one thing about Sembene that I think is really important. Sembene wanted to be a popular artist, and he wanted to make popular films. And he moved from writing books to making films because he realized that literacy rates in West Africa wouldn't get to where he needed them to get his message across in due time, so he became a filmmaker. Turned out he was a very talented filmmaker, one of the greatest in film history, but he wanted to be a popular artist, and he wanted this to be popular art, and he wanted to throw out stories that raised moral, ethical, political issues and get people to think about it. And that's also, I mean, there's a Brechtian element at the end of the film, but it's much less didactic.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's not I don't think of it as a didactic film.
No,
at all.
It isn't. No. It isn't. It is too complex.
Yeah.
Also, he likes his characters too much, if you will. You know, these are not characters that are thrown out there to teach us a lesson. It's a popular cinema in the best sense. He likes the people he talks about, and he makes us like them. Didi.
Gramscian cinema.
Yeah.
Is that what you're trying to say?
More Gramscian
and I think also that at the time when Goncharov was dealing with Oblomov, you know, and Gogol's Dead Souls and all what was happening with Russian literature at in the period, you could, is somehow a little bit, I think. So I mean, I think you pointed it out actually that it's not exactly the same thing as, or it's not. The main character was not exactly the same thing as Oblomov, so there are differences, because also the social conditions actually that produced and I mean, of course, I'm sure Sembene, with his relationship with Russia, must have probably had some experience, had some knowledge of that character type, what Goncharov did with, and what Gogol also was doing with even though they are the two novel, Oblomov and Goncharov's novel and Gogol's, there seem to be, there were differences altogether. So I think that Sembene also knew that he wanted to pass a message. And yes, of course, he did not want to be a filmmaker just for a small club. We wanted to be a filmmaker that reaches out to the people. But of course, that is also the essence of Marxism, mass revolutionary consciousness. So how to reach out to the mass, how to talk to the masses, to the people. So and I wouldn't really, of course, qualify this film as militant cinema. And even Solanas and Gettino made a distinction. Militant cinema, at the time they were making the theory of thought cinema, militant cinema have not been actually confronted. So there had to be a follow-up, as militant cinema is the most advanced category of thought cinema. So I won't qualify this film actually as militant cinema, but it sits within the category of, I think, third cinema, of a radical alternative to the first cinema of Hollywood and the second cinema of Europe, in terms of also what cinema could be, what cinema could do, trying to talk to the people. So oftentimes addressing seemingly ignoring the trappings of realism. So there is no attempt actually to make in most African films of the radical category, there's no identity actually to bury the camera. So you are always encouraged to know that you are being told a story, and the essence of being told a story is that there's no radical difference between art and life. So the essence of art is for you to know that art is there also to make you to consciously to think. You are not encouraged to pretend that this is when you enter the cinema, or that this is you bury, or that this is reality. You identify with the character. There's always a distance. So you know that you are watching a work of art, but at the same time, you know that this art that is on the screen actually has got something to do with the life you are living with. It's not escapism. We, as a person, as an artist who live in the third world, I cannot afford that luxury of thinking that once I step into the cinema, I have buried myself in escapism, that my problem outside there has been solved. The essence of the relationship with us and cinema is to know that this is a slice of what is there, and now I want you to think, what are you going to do about the life you are living? So I think, yes, I agree with you that this is not exactly militant cinema, but this is also Sembene's film after Black Girl, Borom Saret, and also before, how many films then you had Kam de Tiaroye and you had Moulade. So this is actually the work of a person who was once a novelist who became a filmmaker. And like Vincent says, I think also from my own word, I think he a damn good filmmaker. So I think that it is still, it's not a cut and soon, so it's still open for conversation. Whereas I think, for instance, for me, the most artistic, the person who made African cinema artistic was Jibril Job Mambeti. For most African filmmakers, the most important one for all of us is Sembene, because he was the one who told us, who showed us the possibility that African cinema actually could arise. Then it's up to you to know whatever aesthetic form you want to put African cinema, but he had already laid the foundation for us, that the possibility of a different kind of cinema. So yeah.
I mean, I would say very quickly, he's someone who starts out writing literature and then moves into cinema, but you don't get the sense of any of his films that somehow they're like overly literary or something. They're like extremely visually powerful. They're really structured, I would say they're structured around visual ideas rather than literary ideas. And, you know, I think he's someone who really expresses himself visually in his cinema. So it's an interesting... you know, he was equally at home in both mediums, I would say. It's not necessarily a case of someone who's a writer who like then tries to make some films, but like still at heart they're a writer. I mean, he was someone who was equally a filmmaker. He likes his women. He likes his women.
Mm-hmm. But even as a prose stylist, he's very visual.
Yeah.
You know, those stories move along at a pretty brisk pace, and he doesn't waste a whole lot of time for descriptions or boring interiority. He's not Proust, and in a good way. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, please, back there.
Evening, due to the fact Sembene was a communist, do we know his real stance on Islam?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say he was not very favorable to Islam as a, you know, he was. I mean, I think he had the standard Marxist like religion is the opium of the masses idea, as far as I know.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I wouldn't reduce him to it. Have you seen a film called Chedo?
I haven't.
Okay, you should see that film. And it's a film was shot in 1977. It has the most spectacularly gratifying ending of any film I know. Not going to give it away, but you should see it. But it's about the early stages of colonization. it's about a kingdom in what is today Senegal, and there's an encroachment of religion from various parts. So you have Christian missionaries of various stripes, you have a white slaver, and you have an imam who tries to convert everyone to Islam. And there's a story about a princess that gets abducted, and it's all about the imam then trying to replace the king and assume the throne of the king. That does not end well for him. And in that particular film, it's very, very clear that Sembene puts Islam on the same plane as Christian missionaries, or actually considers them to be worse.
Yeah, I don't think he was pro-Christianity either.
No, it wasn't.
I wasn't trying to say that either.
Yeah, no. I mean, the Christian missionaries don't come across as particularly positive characters, but that particular film is very critical of a certain type of Islam.
I would say there's probably in Sembene a certain redemptive power for pre-monotheistic religions. I'm thinking of the mask in Le Mandat, for instance. There's a scene in Le Mandat where I'd be spoiling a lot to explain the whole scene. But essentially, these are the kind of white family travels to Africa out of this guild for how they've exploited, in the end, in a very harmful way, their servant. And you see this young boy who wears this kind of traditional African kind of spiritual mask, and this is just and he's kind of chases them around the city, and that is also a very extremely powerful visual image, where there's a sense of, well, this is a kind of, there's some form of resistance against kind of Western colonialism embodied in this kind of in this image of the mask, at least. So I think that would be where he's a bit more amenable towards kind of religion or spirituality than in, say, Christianity or Islam.
That's pretty much why, but Didi will also say something to this, but that's why I was hesitant to disqualify him as your typical Marxist Enlightenment type critic of religion. You could say that the situation in Africa sometimes only leaves you with bad options, and one of them is Afro-essentialism, where you basically say, African culture needs to be preserved and defended, and there's a pure essence of African culture that needs to prevail over both Christianity and Islam. And there's an element of that in his films, but he's not a simplistic Afro-essentialist. That will be, that's to a large extent, that's also a European projection. Afro-essentialism is, and he doesn't quite buy into this. But there's a famous interview where he stands on the Croisette in Cannes, and the interviewer, French interviewer, asks him, "So, what do you think about how people in Europe understand your films or don't?" And then he basically says, "I don't care. Europe is the periphery. Africa is the center. I am myself the sun." And you could say, okay, that's the Afro-essentialist trap, but there's a lot more going on there. And so I would say he's very critical of Islam, but it's not necessarily tied to his communist past or militancy.
I would say that, this raises a bigger question, which I think is an ambiguity or a contradiction in Sembene, but that is also a contradiction in post-colonialism, anti-colonialism in general, which is well, is the problem of colonialism that it prevented modernization, or that it produced modernization? This is I think that's the conundrum that is the problem with colonialism. Is our beef with colonialism that it prevented modernization or that it produced modernization? What do we actually want? Do we want to go back to some kind of prelapsarian past prior to the kind of colonial invasions? Or do we want to kind of leap forward into this kind of glorious, like, emancipated future? There's like not a clear-cut answer, I would say, to that.
I think one of my, I don't know if I should say opposition actually to the novel Things Fall Apart, which was that in the struggle between Okonkwo and the colonial forces, Okonkwo was reactionary. He was trying to stop the wheel of history. The colonialists who invaded Africa, ironically for me also, we are actually the progressive part, the progressives. Okonkwo was the reactionary. So now there is the, at some point, I think even it still goes on in Africa at the moment. People are still debating it, debating colonialism. Was it good or was it bad? I think it's a fruitless conversation, because for the African people who were colonized, colonialism was bad. For the colonialists, colonialism was good. After all, it built America. But I approach it from the point of view of historical development. Regardless of whether it was good or bad, colonialism was a necessary and inevitable process and period in the development of humanity. And if at all we say we oppose colonialism, it's not on a, as a Marxist, I don't oppose capitalism on a moral basis. So I oppose capitalism on the from the point of view that it has outlived its progressiveness. It's no longer capable of taking humanity forward. It can only give us Ukraine and Gaza. So it gives us wars, dictatorships all over the place. So, and as an artist who live in the third world, I know what I'm talking about. So, imperialist regime has given us nothing but dictatorships. So from Mobutu to this. So whenever there is a progressive leadership, they have got to be assassinated. From Amilcar Cabral to Mondlane. It's a question of like, I guess what is necessary right now, what is necessary right now. It's not a question of just a moral battleground of is this good or is this bad. There is no absolute morality all through history. What was once moral at a particular point is in a different social environment is no longer moral. Morality has not been has never been an absolute. So and I think it's necessary to also say that it was not Africans alone who practiced slavery. Of course, there was slavery before colonialism, before the mainstream slavery and all. And this filmmaker was always showing you that cube of sugar. I grew up eating a sugar called Tet and Lyle. So, and then when I became an adult, I discovered that Tet and Lyle was not just a sugar I was consuming as a child. Tet and Lyle was a plantation. They were plantation owners who were using black people to farm their sugar cane. So the Tate Museum in London is actually implicated in colonialism and slavery. So even though they found museums and art environment, and this is a very clever filmmaker. He keeps on pointing that the cube of sugar is not their job because it's a cube of sugar. He was pointing products of colonialism, imperialism that was also used to enslave people. That these are the products, these are the human labor power that has been turned into this product. That these are without actually calling attention to the fact that I am making a political campaign. So he was actually very, very subtle about it. So I think I'm not just going to say that yes, colonialism was bad or colonialism was good. It was simply an inevitable period in the development of social system and humanity and all that. But you made also a point. One of the films you talked about, the boy with the mask, actually was also a very powerful. Was one of the powerful symbol in that film that you referenced. So, well, I think Sembene is not pro-Islam. One of the funny things that is actually, it's actually funny that when black radicals in America and London when they get angry with imperialism, they change their religion. They become Muhammad Ali instead of Cassius Clay, as if they are not aware that there was also the trans-Saharan slave trade. They think it's only the transatlantic. So slavery has always been. So what business was pointing out that it was not what the filmmaker was doing with religion. I agree. So it's not just he was not just a clear-cut Marxist attitude of religion. He also have his own beliefs somewhere, maybe in the African pantheon. So
yeah, I think we need to probably let people leave. Keeping you prisoner here. I'll just make one more comment and then we'll go, which is, I think it's very interesting and very deliberate that when the shopkeeper is offering Ibrahima the rice, he's like, this is good rice, it's from Indochina. This is 1968. This is Vietnam. That is the key side of resistance against imperialism at that moment. And I think that's a very clear reference from Sembene's part. And I think he's saying that's what's missing in Senegal, is taking the overthrow of like formal colonial rule and extending it to a much more, let's say, anti-capitalist direction. Instead, you have this kind of re-emergence of capitalism in Senegal under the guise of a kind of new independent nation. So it hasn't taken that next step, which is what he's extremely frustrated about, because it's this potential moment of opening. You've overthrown French colonialism. You have this kind of national awakening. Instead of channeling that, as the Vietnamese did, into this kind of the construction of a socialist society, you just see the re-emergence of a kind of indigenous African capitalism instead. And this film shows that. I think Charlotte also shows that even to a greater extent. But that's what I wanted to end up on.
Yeah, I mean, the dish they eat at the beginning is jollof rice, and that yeah, there's a big debate between Ghana and Nigeria about who invented jollof rice, and UNESCO settled the dispute recently by saying it was the Senegalese who invented it. And with that, we close. We wish you a wonderful holiday season. We reconvene in January.
Jennifer Blaylock, is that the next?
Jennifer Blaylock talking about Sambisanga by Sarah Mulder, and we hope to be seeing you all again in January.
All right.
Happy holidays.
Thank you very much.
And
Merry
good
Christmas.
Good start in the new year.